replace himself with the office on Mac. Maybe too much like Windows.
My friends, we're back again. We're back again, my friends. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Darrell White. I'm so pleased to serve as the Director of Cultural Heritage Tourism and here as Director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I take this opportunity to welcome you all to this all-important event occurring in this building at this moment, at this time. The significance and importance of what's going to be discussed this evening is even greater than what is confined within the four walls of this building. Recent events in the news show that the problems that were discussed and researched by this group a year ago are still very pressing around this nation. We have an opportunity to attempt to share that knowledge, share our information, and hope that our efforts will be a part of that process to bring about change, much needed change. I'd like it also at this time to give a personal note of thanks and praise to Dr. Paul Ortiz and all the other members of the group for their efforts to not sit in a classroom in Gainesville, Florida, and just listen to a lecture and expect them to understand fully the magnitude of what has happened historically throughout our nation. For those of you that are unfamiliar with their efforts, this past week, they've done some traveling. I relish and wish I could today do all of the things that I've read they've done within the confines of this past week. Having left Florida, traveling through the state of Alabama, going to various sites that had specific impact on the Civil Rights era, they went to those places. They absorbed the stories that were being told in those communities. They came across from Alabama into the Mississippi Delta, where they, at that point, went to pay tribute and homage to the late, great B.B. King in a visit to his final resting place and museum, and then making their way here to the city of Natchez to follow up on a project and work that they had performed a year ago. That work has been continued here in this community as we are presently undertaking or wrapping up interviews of members of this community who are subjected to what has become known to us as the Parchment Ordeal. Those of you who may be unfamiliar with the event will tell you that in 1965, members of this community who were peacefully gathering to address the community and its government on some wrongs which they had been forced to endure, where they gathered one evening in a church, a couple of churches around town, with the thought that they would take to the streets and march to the center of city government, city and county government. They have been warned that if y'all go marching, y'all get put in jail. But they say that members of the community were about to heed those warnings coming from law enforcement. It was Charles Evans who was speaking before the group, who, upon hearing or seeing their hesitancy, Charles Evans' eyes began to well up and the tears began to fall. And he said, my brother Medgar gave up his life for this movement. And you all act like you're afraid to just walk down the street. Well, at that point, the folks in the church said, we're with you, and we're going to take to the streets. They lined up in the church and they walked outside, where they were subsequently arrested for parading without a permit. So many people had been arrested over a period of a few days that they were all being housed initially in the city auditorium. That facility was not large enough to hold all the people, nor were all of the jails here around this area to accommodate them. So special provisions were made to have them transported to the state penitentiary at Parchment, where they were the superintendent at the penitentiary decided initially for their protection. He would place them in the maximum security sections of the prison, where they were all subjected to whatever protocol and procedure which had been established for folks going to maximum security. The abuses those people had to endure are literally unspeakable, but members of this community did it. In our oral history project, we came to realize they didn't walk through the streets. You see, they walked out of the church and got on buses that have been placed there by the police department. And the buses transported them to the city auditorium. So they never violated the law for which they had been arrested. Yet they were sent to the state penitentiary. They were never officially charged. They never went before a judge or a magistrate. After about 3 days, 4 days, they were told, if you can make bond, you can leave. And we're talking 1965, where you didn't go too far from home if it was dark outside for members of the black community. But anything could happen to you. And they were hundreds of miles away. So, as an outgrowth of the work that was done by this group a year ago, we were able to follow up with the Parchment Ordeal to give voice to those people. So we're all a part of the change, all a part of the new Mississippi. Okay? And I appreciate students for the work that you are doing. I say continue to do more. Don't let this be just a little something you did during the summer break. Make this a part of your life's mission. To others of this community who have come forward to participate in this event this evening, share what you have learned with others. I'm sure that there are people in this community that hold your opinions in very high esteem. And that way, the message does not continually just come from me and a few others. I'd like to consider all of you to be allies in this process now, to getting people to know that the time for change is now, and that you all have now agreed to be a part of the solution rather than a continued part of the problem. I'll now shut my mouth and turn everything over to Dr. Ortiz and the members of the panel who are champing at the bit in order to present their findings to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, good evening. We're just delighted to be with you here again this year. We're just so thankful to Mr. White and to the African American History Museum in Natchez for really making us feel welcome last year and also this year. We are in for a real treat tonight. The title of our panel, just to echo what Mr. White was saying, is Unfinished Business, Race, Democracy, and the Ongoing Struggle for Civil Rights. So you can see that we learned a lot from our trip here last year. Natchez, I don't have to tell you, you live here. Natchez is one of the most historically significant cities, not just in the United States, not just in North America, but in the entire hemisphere. Because Natchez is a city where many different histories, Native, African, Anglo, European, come together. It's a crossroads city and region. I wanted to give you just a very quick glimpse about where we have been, why we come to Mississippi every summer. As Mr. White mentioned, we began our trip this summer in Montgomery, Alabama. We spent a day with the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Equal Justice Initiative, These are cutting-edge, contemporary civil rights struggle organizations. We did an interview, Justin Hosby, who you will hear from in a moment, interviewed Mr. Hinton, a man who'd been on death row for 3 decades, 30 years, and was finally released just this past Good Friday. So the theme of our field work is civil rights history isn't just something that happened a long time ago. There's things happening now, there's unfinished struggles, there's new struggles that we have to surmount and take on. We started coming to Mississippi, and actually this is our 8th trip. We initially would go to the Mississippi Delta, the upper Delta, and the reason that we would go to places like Indianola, initially it wasn't just because Indianola was the birthplace of B.B. King, although that helped. That was another draw for us, but it was really because of the history of the Black freedom struggle, and that I had started going there doing field work when I was a graduate student at Duke University. And we've been going there for 8 years, and I can tell you that the students that we take there year in and year out are the hardest working students at the University of Florida. In fact, if you're from UF on the trip, please raise your hand so folks can see you. These are not just regular students. These are honor students. They win fellowships. They finish honors thesis papers. They're writing dissertations. They're Ford Foundation pre-doctoral fellows. They're really the best of the best. To get outside of the classroom, as Mr. White was saying, you have to work harder. It isn't just about reading. Now, I'm a historian, don't get me wrong, I love reading. I love books. But as you all know, you only get one side of history if all you do is read textbooks. You only get one small side of history if all you do is read textbooks by U.S. historians. Because as we all know, everyone has their own biases, right? But anyway, we started coming here, we started doing the trip 8 years ago. Sarah Blanc is our Mississippi Freedom Trip research coordinator. And Sarah is a great example of how we've been able to sustain this trip. She graduated with honors at UF in 2012. When she came here, and she's made trips several times, she wrote her honors thesis at UF, won high honors for her thesis, and her work focused on the Poor People's Campaign, or the Mississippi component of the Poor People's Campaign. And that, again, that thesis came out of her oral history experience on the trip. So last summer was the first summer that we came to your city. First time we came to Natchez. And I can just tell you briefly that the story was an interesting story. Mr. White, you know this. I'm very active in an organization called Veterans for Peace. I'm a military veteran. And one of our most active members in the Gainesville branch is a gentleman by the name of Pierce Butler. And Pierce, as many of you know, has a connection to Kathy Moody. And so Pierce talked to me one day and he said, have you all ever been to Natchez? He said, you always go out to the Delta, up there in the north. Have you ever thought about going to Natchez? I said, Pierce, I never have thought about that. But the challenge is I don't know anyone in Natchez. And so he said, well, I know someone. And so from that point, Kathy put us in contact with Mr. White. And the rest, as they say, is history. But we have loved being here. And I mentioned that this is a hard-working group. We don't just do interviews. Now, a lot of university-based oral history programs will do interviews, will come and kind of swoop into the community, do interviews, and then leave. And sometimes you never hear from them again. But we want to prove that we're different. And so the interviews that we did last summer, Sarah worked really hard, and many of our staff worked really hard to make sure that the interviews we did last summer, we transcribed those. And those are all available. We're giving copies to the museum tonight as part of our panel, and to all of the narrators, the people that we interviewed. So we wanted to let you know that we don't just come in and say, oh, this is an interesting history, now let's take it back to our little university corner. We want to focus on the reciprocal elements of community-based oral history. So without further delay, I'm going to introduce our panelists, and again, you're in for a real treat, because these are the smartest graduate students, not just the University of Florida, but I really think in the entire country. I mean, they are amazing. They're all working on dissertations. Two are in anthropology, one is in English. I have the honor to serve on all of their dissertation committees. And I'll introduce them one at a time. I'll give the titles of their presentations. They're going to do PowerPoint because they're working in the 21st century, right? And so you know they got to have some PowerPoint. You're going to hear some audio, which is going to be quite interesting. Each of them are going to present about 15 minutes. They're going to keep it concise because we want to leave time for Q&A. And I'll ask if you wouldn't mind holding your questions till the end of the presentations. And then we should have a great chance to talk with them. Ready to? Yeah. Okay. All right, so I'll introduce them in the order of their presentations, and then they'll just take it from here. So the first presenter is Justin Donovan. He's at the very end. He just returned from doing archaeological field work in Ethiopia and Africa. Had a very productive research trip there, although we missed him quite a bit. The title of his presentation tonight is Veterans of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, of course, Mental Trauma and the War for Equality. Our second presenter is Justin Hosby. And Justin is also, I should say Justin Donovan is a PhD candidate in anthropology at the University of Florida, as is Justin Hosby. And Justin just returned to our program from a full year of field work in New Orleans, working on questions of educational equity, again, an unfinished struggle, one of the many unfinished struggles in this country. And so Justin's title of his presentation is Race, Citizenship, and Justice in American Democracy. And our third presenter this evening is Randy Bill Sadler. Randy is the newest research coordinator for our African American history project at the University of Florida. We focus on the Black freedom struggle in Florida, the Gulf South generally, and Randy's been a tremendous asset, an incredibly promising intellectual who is finishing her dissertation right now in the Department of English. And her presentation is, and I hope I get the technology aspect part of this, her presentation tonight is titled Hashtags Say Her Name. Mm-hmm. Got it? Okay.
You got it.
Hashtag Say Her Name, because I don't do the hashtag thing. I see it in general. I kind of see it, but I don't do it. But hashtag Say Her Name, Excavating Black Women's Rhetorical Contributions to the Civil Rights Movement. All right, without further delay, Justin.
All right, thank you all for coming out today from your respective places. Normally when we give these presentations at conferences, we tend to read from a paper. It tends to be very theoretical and in a lot of cases very boring, even for us presenting. So we try to break away from that a bit and talk about topics that I think will resonate more with us and with the audience and kind of give us a break from the jargon and to get at some of the more hard-hitting ideas and to have a conversation at the end of it. So without further ado, I named my title Veterans of SNCC, Mental Trauma and the War for Equality. This title really came about from listening to some of the interviews we did in the Delta. A lot of people would use terminology that I had heard in some of our war interviews that we had done. In the oral history program, we do interviews in many different areas, focus on many different World War II veterans and Vietnam and so forth and so on. And I kept hearing terms like veterans, I've heard foot soldiers, I've heard people talk about being ambushed. And all of these terms started to make me think about this whole freedom struggle, particularly Freedom Summer, as a war zone. And if you hear people talk about it, they talk about it almost as a war zone. So to explore that a little bit further, I decided to look more closely into this whole idea of veterans. And not only just veterans, but the mental health issues that come after that. A lot of times we'll see snippets of different demonstrations. We'll see the water hoses, we'll see the dogs, and then we think they just got thrown in jail and released a couple days later. But there's a series of mental illnesses, mental triggers, and trauma that's associated with that they carried with them, not only at that time, not only days later, but for the rest of their lives. And it comes out in some of the interviews that we have done. And while it was difficult for some of them to share, they felt that it was very important for them to share it. So as a result of that, I have to warn you that this presentation is a little more hard-hitting than some of the presentations that I've done in the past. So just to give you a preparation and a heads up. And it focuses more specifically on what happened to these people, not only during their experiences, but afterwards as well. And then I'll offer a recommendation at the end for maybe ways we can continue to look at civil rights veterans in the future. So the interviews we did a number of interviews with a number of different individuals, but for this presentation I pulled from 3 hard-hitting interviews that took place in the Mississippi Delta. One is with Alan Cooper on the left here, the other is with Dr. Gwendolyn Zahara Simmons in the middle here, and the last one is with Mr. Bright Wynn. Now all 3 of these individuals participated in Freedom Summer in 1964, and they all had varying but similar experiences. I'm not sure, I don't believe they really knew each other too well when they were working Freedom Summer, but afterwards they came to know each other and they came to build collaborations based off of their shared experiences. Okay, so again, these interviews were collected over the last 8 years. And again, I'm trying to focus more so on not just the physical violence they experienced, but the multiple violences they experienced. And I'll talk about different types of violence, economic violence, educational violence, and so forth. And I'll break it down at different stages so we can kind of see this analogy with war. They had a recruitment process, they had a boot camp process, they had an active duty process. And while they didn't term these things in these ways while it was going on, it becomes very clear once you listen and see the interviews. So we'll hear snippets from them as well. All right, so to begin, of course, the recruitment process. How do you get involved in the movement in the first place? Well, for many of them, they were recruited. They were recruited at their universities, they were recruited at their colleges. You had individuals who are a part of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that went on through different universities throughout the North and the South, asking for active participants to come and join them. And I'll play a short clip so you can hear in a second about what that process was like. Bright Wynn, the individual that we saw on the right, he was recruited by Charles McLaurin at his college. And he said that he felt like Charles was speaking specifically to him when he described the work that they were doing and the fact that they needed more individuals to sign up. Dr. Simmons, who we saw in the middle, she was actually a student at Spelman College. She had come from Tennessee and was a student at Spelman College at the time, and she was specifically told not to get involved in the movement. She was told by her grandmother, she was told by her mother, she was told by her father. They said, you went to Spelman to get an education, get your education and come back. Don't get involved in all that mess, you're gonna get killed, you're gonna lose your scholarship, so forth and so on. It wasn't only her family that told her that, but it was Spelman University itself. Now this might be a little crazy if you look back on it, thinking that a predominantly African-American university, historically black college, is telling students of color not to get involved in a movement that's trying to promote civil rights for African-Americans and students of color, but that's the way it was at the time. So at Spelman College, they said anybody who's caught being involved in any civil rights demonstrations, you will lose your scholarship if you have scholarship, and you will be suspended from the university. So this was a very serious thing. What she would do is she would actually sneak out. Her roommate was a relative of Ralph Abernathy. So she would sneak out during the day and go to Abernathy's church with her roommate, and they would come back later at night. She ended up getting involved in the movement very early on after her freshman, sophomore year. And as a result of that, it had a powerful impact on her relationship with her family. And I'll play a clip really quickly for you.
When I left, she had a car, and she came with my girlfriend to pick me up. And of course, my grandmother, my mother, and my father. My mother was crying, my grandmother was crying, and my father was wanting to beat me, you know. And I was like, I'm grown and I can leave. You all cannot keep me here. I'm a grown person, you know. And so, of course, my grandmother said, if you leave, don't ever come back. So that was how I left. And I basically took the Greyhound and I cried all the way.
Okay. So you see her family automatically shunned her as soon as she joined this movement. So when we talk about violence now, we're talking about violence against families. This is a family that's torn apart by a decision to join the movement. We don't often hear this when we talk about civil rights movement. Additionally, she suffered then, if you want to consider it, economic violence and educational violence in the sense that she now had to withdraw from Spelman University. And even though school fees had been paid, even though she had scholarship, she had to lose all of that to join the movement. So just things to keep in mind. Okay, after the recruitment process, they came to their boot camp. So Freedom Summer 1964, before they all came down to Mississippi, the groups met in Oxford, Ohio. And the idea was they would meet in Oxford, Ohio, get the political training, and the social training that goes along with participating in nonviolent actions. And then from there, they would come down to Mississippi and do the voter registration work that they were destined to do. So during this process, they realized that the violence they were experiencing in the South was not just relegated to the South, but also in the North. Dr. Simmons actually stayed for 2 orientations. They had 2 separate orientations for 2 groups because the groups were very large. During the first orientation, she actually met Cheney and I believe it was Goodman, who would then later on, you would hear in the news, become killed, or they went missing, as they said. The second orientation she participated in as well, and that's when they got the news that these 3 men had been found missing. Well, they hadn't been found missing, they were missing, and therefore, anybody who wanted to leave now was allowed to leave, but they could not guarantee your safety. And for her, that was very traumatic because she said she didn't think that they would kill white people. That's what she said. She said she knew that, you know, they would threaten the lives of blacks and so forth. But when they found out that white young men were getting killed, they knew that it was hands off. Anything could go. So as a result of that, there was this fear of threat now. They're going into what they consider now the war zone. They're preparing for it. Additionally, in Oxford, Ohio, the people there weren't receptive of their presence either. While they knew that these people weren't going to stay in Oxford, Ohio, they knew what they were going to ultimately do in Mississippi. And they were disrupting a social system and a social order that some of them held very dear. So as a result of that, they experienced some attacks in Oxford, Ohio, even before they came down to Mississippi. And I'll play a short clip of that as well.
The woman who was from Carleton College, who was, I had met and been a student with at Spelman, she and I were attacked at a small little convenience store there, and that really blew my mind because they said, there go 2 of them freedom riders, and these white men chased us from the store. We were fortunate that we actually got to her Volkswagen and got in it, but because there was so many of them, the Volkswagen couldn't take off. They literally held it. I mean, and the only thing that saved us was that a car of SNCC guys, not looking for us or anything, but they had just come to the store. And when they got out of their car and saw what was going on, they ran over there and jumped these white guys. So I'm like, I'm gonna get killed before I even get to Mississippi. So I was stunned. I was like, and they were calling her a nigger lover and me a nigger, that was also shocking that these were men willing to hurt us. And we were 2 women, and one like I was a black guy,
Right.
And they were still incensed. Yeah, it was really scary.
So after the boot camp phase, then they actually end up coming to Mississippi. They're distributed throughout different parts of the Delta. Some of them are in Indianola, some of them are in Cleveland, and throughout. And it's here that they experience a heavy concentration of violence. Some of the stories they still can't talk about today. So we left those aside and we focused on the things that they did prefer to talk about and the things that they did want to express to us. Bright Wind specifically, Bright Wind specifically referred to a bombing at a house that he was staying at. So Bright Wind was the officer of communications. And what he would do is anytime he needed to communicate with another branch of the movement, he was in charge of the telephone calls and communications and so forth. He would also deal with transportation. Well, one day there was a man coming to the house that they were staying in to fix the refrigerator. Now, when he was coming into the house to fix the refrigerator, there was 2 of the Freedom Riders, 1 black male, 1 white female, were laying in the same bed together. And this person fixing the refrigerator saw this. So he left, and the matron of the house later found out that these people were laying in bed together when he came, and they said, they're gonna bomb us. We have to prepare for this. And as a result of that, they had to make preparations. There was a lot of surveillance around the house, and as a result of that, Mr. Wynn stayed in, and he made sure that everybody got home safe that night. He stayed by the telephone and by the couch that night. When everybody came in, somewhere around midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, there was a large explosion, and his bedroom that he was supposed to be sleeping in was actually firebombed. And the woman in the bathroom, who was changing her clothes, was shocked as well. Everybody eventually made it out of the house, but the house was in disrepair. Bright Wynn never really talked about that situation until last year, and it's really when he started feeling comfortable about telling the situation. Of course, the trauma associated with not only being in the house, but knowing that you were supposed to be in that bed was shocking enough for him. And we later found out that Mrs. Magruder, the owner of the house, actually knew her house was going to be firebombed because her insurance was mysteriously canceled some weeks before. So she's wondering, okay, why is my insurance being canceled? What she didn't tell anybody was that she later got additional insurance because she realized that something was going to happen. So because of that, she was able to collect insurance on the house, but still, the trauma of that experience in that site is still there. And the area where the house is still standing as well. In addition to that, Alan Cooper also experienced an attack in Inverness. And it was there, him and another freedom rider were going to pick up somebody who they had correspondence with. They said they walked into the room to pick up the person, and everybody was looking down. Nobody would look them in the eyes. They didn't say anything, they didn't do anything. As soon as they walked in the door, they said, uh-oh, we gotta get out of here. They turned around, they left the door, and they were ambushed. Alan Cooper was beaten, his knee was busted, his skull was fractured, and he lost his kidney. Otis was able to make it out, and as a result, he later came back and they met Alan Cooper at the hospital. So those are some of the more physical violences that these people faced. Dr. Simmons talks a little bit more specifically about some of the emotional trauma that was associated with it. While she wasn't physically attacked, she witnessed some things that disrupted her and made her feel uncomfortable. So I will play this one very quickly.
The Klan really started a reign of terror there in Jones County. Cross burnings, threats, and all of that. The last hurrah for me was we were organizing a massive demonstration in Jackson, and I really hope to do some research to find out again what we were organizing for, because at one demonstration, 1,000 of us were arrested in Jackson, Mississippi, right outside the state capitol building. And there were so many of us that they basically were hauling us in garbage trucks and stuff. The paddy wagons, they didn't have enough of them, and they took us to the fairgrounds and put us in basically places where when the fair comes to town, they would keep the livestock, because the jails could not hold all of us. So I was there for 15 days, and I really think I pretty much suffered maybe a mild breakdown. I mean, they harassed us, tormented us, and I was already tired from just trying to stay alive that whole time, trying to keep a project going and all. But when I got out of that lockup, and of course I had seen 2 people beaten almost to death, which just, that was shocking. I mean, even though, you get hit and all this, but in this case, they tried to kill this woman. I mean, I thought she was dead when they took her out. But what happened was they were constantly tormenting us. They wouldn't let us sleep. So they would keep us awake with loud screeching noises and loud music, and they'd make us stand up, 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, then sit back down on basically floor. There was nothing, because this is where they kept the livestock, right? And get up, get down, get up, get down. Well, this was a heavy-set lady, and she was just sick and tired of it, So when you wouldn't get up, the men, and they were all men who were right in there with us. So it wasn't like you're in a jail with them. They were inside this enclosure with us, constantly messing with us, jugging us with sticks. And so in this case, they poked her and said, "Get up, nigga." and she grabbed the stick out of the man's hand and came up between his legs. And I mean, you know, he screams in pain. And then these white guys come over there and they just beat her to a bloody pulp. And I know I had tremendous guilt that we didn't do anything. I mean, we just sort of stood there, the women, and it was a lot of us. I mean, I don't know what might have happened if we had jumped them, but we outnumbered them. You know, whether they would have come in there and blown us away. But I felt tremendous guilt. And I thought she was dead because she was unconscious when they took her out. So that was very devastating. Then the other thing that I really just was so terrible to me was we had a lot of the teenagers just saw us marching through the black neighborhood, marching toward the state capitol, and people just jumped off their porches with their slides on and wound up getting arrested. And so we had a lot of young girls in there, you know, maybe 13, 14, and there was some sexual assaults that went on in there with these white men. And that also just blew me away, of these young girls. So when I got out, I was a mess. I was in bad shape, but I didn't know it. And so I had 2 automobile accidents back to back, and I was definitely the cause. I just drove right through a red light. I mean, because, you know, I now know it was PTS, you know.
So you hear that there's a lot of emotional trauma associated with a lot of these events. Now what we have to kind of situate in a certain time frame. PTSD and these mental trauma illnesses weren't really becoming reported until after the Vietnam War. And it wasn't immediately after the Vietnam War. It was sometime after the Vietnam War, because they were seeing that a lot of these soldiers were coming home and having issues dealing with a lot of the trying to get reassociated back into daily life. So as a result, the diagnosis for PTSD has gone through a number of different iterations, and it continues to change now. It's very difficult to treat PTSD and mental illnesses, and so it's almost like a moving target. So a lot of these people knew that they had been traumatized, but they didn't know there was a term for it. They didn't know what kind of medical treatments were available. They didn't have access to doctors who knew what kind of medical treatments were available. So these things kind of compounded upon each other and led to what many of them called burnout, some of them called losing their nerve, and what would eventually be classified as PTSD. Additionally, as a result of that, one of the main treatments they ask is you need a support network, a social network when you're going through these things. And as you heard, Dr. Simmons lost contact with her family. Alan Cooper also lost contact with his family. Alan Cooper's father took him out of his will. He said he was afraid he said his father was moderately wealthy, and his father was afraid that he would give away his money to civil rights activism and to other movements if he had passed away. So he took him out of the will. And then his brothers and sisters no longer associated with him, in part because of his work with civil rights, but also then in part because of the trauma he had faced as a result of his PTSD. And so he's not allowed to see his own nieces and nephews. So again, this kind of compounds into a larger issue. And I think it's important then that we begin to look at this whole idea of terror as being used as a weapon. It's difficult to say whether or not these police officers and these law enforcement were aware of the long-term effects that their actions would have, but it's clear that they continued to operate in such a manner where they were trying to get these effects and these outcomes from these people to dissuade them. So we can begin to see terror as another weapon being used against these civil rights activists that continues to proliferate today. And just to give a quick understanding of PTSD, it's an anxiety disorder that results usually from exposure to a traumatic event that involves actual or threatened death or serious injury. Nowadays, in the past 10, 20 years, they've started to expand this definition from warfare, what we mostly know it associated with, to natural disasters, to abuses, both verbal and physical, and to other instances that can trigger PTSD and other mental trauma. The symptoms usually involve re-experiencing events, as well as avoiding stimuli related to the event. So anything that brings up memories, you try to shun and avoid. And then what they call hyperarousal, which means that you're constantly on alert, constantly on edge. And as a result of that, you lose sleep, insomnia, and there's a number of health aspects associated with that as well. And then there's also been studies done as to what happens to people who are seriously impacted by PTSD. According to the National Center for PTSD 2008, they said that military veterans who have PTSD are less likely to be married, they have more divorces, more marital and parenting problems, more occupational instability, and higher rates of arrest, felonies, conviction than general society, in addition to a number of other personal and mental illnesses. So I argue that this is almost like the hidden cost of the civil rights movement, and something that we need to pay more attention to, because many of these people are still alive and they're still dealing with these traumas on a daily basis. And we're looking not only now at the physical or the mental damage that's done to them, but if you have occupational instability, this is almost another form of economic violence. So these people can't work, it's difficult to get training in new skills, and so forth and so on. Additionally, there's been research done on what they call intergenerational trauma from PTSD. So they've done some work on Holocaust survivors and found that Holocaust survivors who suffer from PTSD, their children are more likely to later suffer from PTSD, whether or not they were involved in any type of serious traumatic event themselves. And so as a result of that, they've also found that when the mother has PTSD, the children are more likely to be involved in it than the father. And some of that might actually be tied to biology in terms of cortisol levels, and I won't get too much into biology, but cortisol levels into the fetus while the baby is going through their stage of gestation. So as a result of that, we begin to see that PTSD becomes a larger proliferation, and we can begin to move on then to discussing, well, what forms of restitution should we take as a result of this? And I argue that we should offer civil rights veterans, well, not only just people participating in Freedom Summer, but the civil rights veterans that were engaged in other demonstrations and other actions, the full benefits that we extend to military veterans. And this includes the health care, most importantly. Because I think access to health care, especially if you suffer from these mental health issues, is very important. Now, the system is not perfect for military veterans themselves currently. At the current moment, since 1998, if you're a military veteran, you're allowed cost-free health care up to 5 years after leaving active duty. Of course, these civil rights veterans would be much longer, so you have to extend that. But these are things that they could begin to then talk about and to see then, okay, these are some ways that we can try to offer some restitution. Of course, monetary and other options have been proposed, but really I think that this type of mental health and other healthcare services are very important and should be looked at more closely. And that's it for my presentation. And I would like to thank the people that were involved in this interviewing process, as well as some of the other civil rights leaders that were involved in these movements who passed away recently, and some who passed away in the past as well. And thank you.
All right, I want to first say good evening to everybody, and thank you again for coming out and offering your time to engage with us on these issues that we find to be personally important as well as politically. And I think that by you guys showing up here, that speaks a lot to you guys' commitment to these ideas as well. The title of my presentation is Race, Citizenship, and Justice in American Democracy. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I study educational inequity in New Orleans, Louisiana. I'm not sure if you all are familiar with what's happening in New Orleans post-Katrina, but after Hurricane Katrina happened, every school in New Orleans has been essentially converted into a charter school. So there are no longer any more neighborhood public schools in the city of New Orleans. Now, besides the obvious effects on communities and neighborhoods that has, it also can be seen as a method of a form of violence in itself, because when you have entire schools that were essentially community institutions for generations that no longer exist, and you have people being fractured and sent across the entire city for their education every single day, that has an effect on community cohesion as well as an effect on identity, because who are you now? School is such an important marker of identity for anybody, particularly people who are from New Orleans. And I know that people from Natchez and have a very strong connection to the Delta region, also to New Orleans as well. So for my own research, I kind of see the Gulf Coast area and the Mississippi River as kind of a site to kind of analyze, because it's a very peculiar and particular site that oftentimes you see things happen in excess in Mississippi that wouldn't happen in other places. And it's partly because of the confluence of the history, the culture, and also the importance of cotton, sugar, and these kind of plantation economies to this area of the United States historically and even into the present day. So I want to kind of analyze the entire Gulf Coast region. So my presentation speaks to things that happen in New Orleans as well as things that happen in Mississippi and Alabama. And also I kind of just focus on just the Gulf Coast area. That's how I kind of choose to analyze my own research. So this is the title of my presentation. If you guys can see this picture here, this is a picture that when I first went to New Orleans to do my dissertation field work, I found at an artist market on Frenchman Street. Now for anthropologists, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with anthropologists and essentially how our discipline works, but we have to do 1 year of extended field work wherever we go to kind of get our PhDs. That's kind of like our way of kind of paying our dues. You do a year what they call in the field. For some people, it's Africa. For some people, it's Malaysia. For me, it was New Orleans. People always said, well, you know, it's not much field work to be done in New Orleans. It's mostly fun, right? How do you pay your dues? It's so much fun in New Orleans. But, you know, it was over the course of living there for a year, you really get a sense and feel for even just a glimpse of how people who live in the city really experience life in that place. So this picture, this is at the artist market, I bought this lithograph. And the way this lithograph was actually made was that these are all transparencies of different photos that have been placed together and layered on top of each other. So you can see you have a picture of a young black boy, you have the crown, then you have the tuba, and then you have, if you can notice that, the grid line of the city of New Orleans all transposed together to form one photo. So when I first saw this photo, I was taken aback by it. And I think that most people who are at the artist market would have no idea about the history of what this photo actually is. Does anybody know who that is in that picture? Just raise your hand if you know. Anybody else know? So this is what was most appalling to me, because if you said you know who that person was, this is actually George Stinney, and he's the youngest person ever to be executed in the United States. He was 14 years old when he was executed. And this is the photo that was actually taken right before his execution. So for people who are in the artist market in New Orleans, they are thinking this is just a boy who may be from New Orleans, from the area, who's a street performer, because he's in this photo with a crown and a tuba, and you see New Orleans behind him, but he's been placed totally out of context historically and also considering what happened to him. So I asked the artist, I said, you know, because I said, oh my God, that's George Stinney. And he said, oh yeah, man, you know who that is? And I said, yes, of course, I know. He was the youngest person ever to be executed in the United States. And he said, yeah, man, that's a sad, tragic history. This is kind of my homage to him. That's just how he framed it. But for me, I was thinking of how many people have bought this photo and had this photo hanging in their homes without knowing that this was the last photo taken of him before he was executed at 14 years old. People don't know that, and I think that says a lot about lots of things that kind of underlie the structure of our society in terms of how black people are seen, in terms of how violence against black people gets commodified and also consumed. So that's kind of how I'm framing my presentation today, in terms of that consumption of violence against black people and black bodies. Okay. So I want to give you a little more background about George. This is the actual photo of him before he was executed. He was 14 years old. He was born on October 21st, 1929, and he was executed on June 16th, 1944. And it was remarkable to me, as you'll see later, because June 16th was also the day that I interviewed Anthony Ray Hinton at the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. So all these things are kind of converging in ways that I didn't even realize until, you know, it happened. So I think that's why I thought it would be really important for me to kind of bring these two lives together and show you in detail what happened. But George Stinney, he was at age 14, he was executed. He's an African-American young boy from South Carolina. And actually what happened was there were two young white girls who were murdered. They were murdered with blunt force trauma to the head in the town where he lived. And what linked George Stinney to those little girls is that they were actually looking for wildflowers to pick. and they drove by the Stinney household, and Stinney and his sister were outside tending to the cattle. Their family owned the cow. So the little girl said, "Hey, do you guys know where we can find maypops?" And George and his sister said, "No, we don't know." And they kind of just went along and went on. And then about 2 hours later, they went missing, and their families were looking for them. And eventually they were found dead. And there actually was a sexual assault to one of the young girls as well. So the fact that he was the last person that was reported to have seen the two young girls linked him to the case. So what happened was, of course, the police system came, they grabbed him. His family was actually run out of town. So he actually had to face trial and everything without his family, because they would have been lynched had they stayed inside the town. So his family was left, he was taken down. His trial lasted for 2 hours. He had a 2-hour trial. He was convicted in 2 hours by an all-white jury, of course, and he was executed shortly thereafter. So George Stinney was 14 years old. He was only 5'1" and weighed about 90 pounds. And what was tragic about his execution was that they actually gave him like one of those huge Bibles to carry, because he couldn't fit into the electrocution chair. So he actually had to sit on top of the Bible to be restrained in the chair before he was executed. That kind of gives you a sense of what his size was, and the fact that he could be convicted of essentially a superhuman act of murdering 2 young girls that are roughly his age as well, without any kind of physical evidence to suggest a fight, a battle at all. That speaks a lot to the way that criminal justice allows these kind of atrocities to occur in our society historically, and then, as we see with Anthony Hinton, into the present day. So, as you can see, this is a picture, and I think if you go back to the photo again, for me, I thought about, what does this art piece say about just, the memorialization of Black death in this country? Because essentially this is akin to a lynching photo, I would say, how you have those photos, people would actually have photographs and postcards of lynchings. And I feel like this is akin to that, because although people may not know that, people don't really know that's what they're purchasing. That is what they're circulating and purchasing by buying this art piece, and by the artist not really being forthcoming about what it is, and by kind of obscuring his story, his life, by placing him in the context of New Orleans, as if he was a street performer in New Orleans. That makes it even more, to me, more peculiar, and it kind of speaks to so much more about that. So that's kind of how I came to learn more about George Stinney, and about, kind of how black death is seen, and how it's kind of commodified and consumed. This is Mr. Anthony Ray Hinton, and I had the honor of interviewing Mr. Anthony Hinton with a couple other people from the SPOC team as well on June the 16th. And Anthony Ray Hinton's story, it has so many parallels to George Stinney. Now, Anthony Ray Hinton, he was convicted of capital murder, 2 offenses of capital murder. There were 2 fast food restaurant managers who were killed within an hour time span in Birmingham, Alabama. And what happened was, what convicted him was that the ballistics expert said that the same bullets that killed the 2 men who were the 2 restaurant managers, his mother owned a gun with the same kind of bullet. That was the one piece of evidence that linked him to everything, and he was convicted. Now, Anthony Ray Hinton, of course, he was known as, he was called the most dangerous criminal in Birmingham at the time of the case. This was in 1985. So in talking to Mr. Hinton, he kind of listed what he said. There were 5 things that he said, in his opinion, damned him into being essentially convicted of a crime he did not commit. He said the first thing was the jury composition. Mr. Hinton, there was a jury of 8 white people and 5 blacks on the jury. The second thing was that he had a white prosecutor. In the whole state of Alabama, there's only one black attorney, one black district attorney in the entire state, and that's in Selma. So in 68 counties, you only have 1 black district attorney. He also said that his judge was white, and that also contributed to how the justice was kind of carried out, because he said that when the judge told him that you've been convicted and sentenced to death, the judge had a smile on his face when he said it to him. And this is 1985. I was born in 1986, so this is still, roughly within the time span of my own lifetime. He said that the 2 victims were white. And in the state of Alabama, there's a statistic that says that of all the cases that people are convicted of murder that end up being executed, 80% of them have white victims. Despite 65% of all the victims of murder in Alabama are actually African American. So if you kill a white person in Alabama and you're African American, you're more likely to be put to death. That's a statistical fact at this point. And that's also what damned Mr. Hinton. And also, he said that him having a white lawyer also affected his chances, because he says that on some level, his lawyer wasn't really invested in seeing his freedom. Of course, him being a man, he was working class man. He didn't have access to a high-powered attorney. So essentially, the case became an open and shut case once they got the ballistics expert to confirm that those bullets were the same. And actually, this case went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Alabama Supreme Court fought it for 15 years. It took 16 years. The U.S. Supreme Court eventually read the case and unanimously exonerated him, because it was found out that the ballistic expert who actually matched up the bullets, he actually had a vision impairment. And also, not only that, he could not even operate in court. He tried to demonstrate, I guess, the apparatus through which he did the comparison. He could not even do that in court. So he was obviously incompetent. And what happened, they actually looked at the footage, the testimony of Anthony Ray Hinton's boss, because he was working at the night that these murders occurred. And he worked at a warehouse in which he was locked in all night. The warehouse doors were locked. Workers could not leave the warehouse at night. And his boss attested to the fact that I saw Anthony Ray Hinton working at the time of the alleged murders. He said that, and despite that being said, and despite that, he was still convicted. So in my mind, I'm thinking, what were the motives of the prosecutor? Because obviously these were two people who were murdered in cold blood, who's needed justice. Why would this prosecutor invest so much energy into convicting Anthony Ray Hinton because he was a convenient target, because he was a poor, working class, essentially African American man in Birmingham, Alabama. And what Mr. Hinton said was that the prosecutor was running for a local office, and he wanted to have a tough on crime stance. This is in the 1980s, so he thought that by having a really big marquee case, he could kind of improve his standings and kind of get that elected office. But as I said before, my question is that, that's so much excess, that's so gratuitously to kind of convict somebody and to put them on death row for 30 years merely for a local public office. To me, that's insanity in lots of ways. So Anthony Ray Hinton, after for 30 years, he's been exonerated. He just got out of prison. He gets off of death row on Good Friday of this year. So he's only been out for about 2.5, almost 3 months. And meeting Mr. Hinton and having been able to interview him, it was remarkable that the fact that he still has no anger. He has no bitterness. Mr. Hinton said that I lost 30 years of my life to a racist criminal justice system. If I even actually sit to think about that and get angry about that, I'll lose even more years off of my life. At this point, my whole life is centered around interacting with other human beings. Being in solitary confinement for 30 years, he values being able to sit down and talk to somebody face to face. I asked him, just to kind of make small talk before the interview began, I asked him, are you watching the NBA finals? Are you rooting for anybody? And he was like, honestly, at this point, no. I can't say I even care about basketball, because honestly, being here right now, being able to speak to someone, look them in their eyes, and actually engage with them on a meaningful level, that's all I care about for the rest of my life. That's all that I want to do. So he actually he has received no restitution from the state at all, despite the fact that he was wrongfully convicted in 30 years. So the Equal Justice Initiative, they're the ones who kind of fought for his freedom, and after 15 years, they got him out, and they're trying to plan now strategically, should we sue the state or try to get restitution for the 30 years that were lost? That's what they're trying to decide at this juncture. But for Mr. Hinton, there are so many, as Justin was mentioning in his presentation, the PTSD, the trauma of being in solitary confinement. He said that he could smell. He saw 30 people die over the course of his time on death row. He said he could smell their flesh after the electrocutions happened. He said he could hear people screaming. He could see people had committed suicide, slitting their wrists. He was in the arena where he actually witnessed all of those things. So for him, the trauma of that has him kind of almost shell-shocked in lots of ways. So for him, he doesn't like going out to the malls or to go shopping. He's like, being around so many people like that often kind of makes me jittery because I've been so confined to a certain space, a certain routine. He said that he slept in the fetal position for 30 years. And he's like, even now, he has a larger bed, but he still can't get out of the fetal position because that's the way his body's been patterned to live for 30 years. And it's remarkable that, you can place human beings under this kind of torture for 30 years because I see this as torture. If you're on death row for 30 years, you know that your time is coming. Although he never received an actual date of execution, for 30 years, he's always on the edge of life and death. And to live on the edge of life and death in that way, and not even have the personal autonomy to even commit suicide if you wanted to commit suicide, that is a profound level of torture that he's experienced for 30 years of his life. And it was remarkable to just meet him and get to know him and see and hear his story. For my own research, and this is what brings me back kind of to my own research, because I do work in post-Katrina New Orleans. And in post-Katrina New Orleans, as you all know, there was, lots of human rights abuses occurred that continue to occur to this very day. There was ethnic cleansing. There were genocidal practices that happened. I think that for lots of people now who kind of theorize about racism in the United States and also in the Atlantic world, they talk about the importance of framing racism in terms of genocide. Joy James, in her book, Resisting State Violence, she says that the moral import of racism is virtually meaningless after it has been severed from genocide. So if you're talking of racism and you're not speaking of the genocidal practices through which racism kind of manifests throughout this particular world, you kind of lose the moral import of even discussing it. This is a picture here I took of, that's the Angola prison farm. And in New Orleans, actually, when I was doing my ethnographic field research, and I was interviewing people who had been to school in New Orleans who were in their early 20s, they told me that there was actually a field trip that all New Orleans public school children go to every year to Angola prison. So for me, I'm from Atlanta originally. So for me, I thought, wait, you guys went to a prison farm as a school field trip, ritually, like in third grade, everybody does that? And they were like, yeah, that's what we do. We learn about work and industries and how the prison system kind of helps, prop up the economy of Louisiana. It's a lesson for them. But in my mind, I'm thinking, how are you patterning children to actually prepare themselves to be okay with future incarceration or even the whole system of having an economic system propped up by essentially slavery in the United States in the contemporary moment, through taking kids at 8 years old to Angola prison on a field trip? What does that say? How does that kind of affect their lives? So as anthropologists, that's what I'm concerned with mostly, how these exposures to these kinds of violences affect how people come to see themselves and experience themselves. So just a bit more about my work. I'm really into geography, as I mentioned before. That's why Natchez is such an important site to me as well, because I'm into geography and the idea of the Gulf Coast as kind of a zone of, kind of excess where you have lots of precariousness to disaster. You have lots of environmental catastrophes that occur here regularly. So my idea is just kind of look at how geography, how race, and how class come together and create a context of essentially kind of a existential precariousness that so many people have to face of all racial backgrounds, but mostly of lower class socioeconomic status along the Gulf Coast region. So this is a picture of Hurricane Katrina. And also I wanted to talk a bit about philosopher Lewis Gordon and his idea called bad faith and anti-black racism. And Lewis Gordon is a philosopher, and he kind of argues about what's the nature of racism in American society. And he says that for so many kind of interventions into ending racism, there's always this presumption that ignorance is behind it. People don't know about black people, so they're racist towards them because they have preconceived notions, they've never met them before. So if we have more exposure to black people, racism will end. So we need more diversity programs, more multiculturalism to kind of defend that. But what Lewis Gordon argues is that racism against black people, especially in the South, has never been about ignorance, because black Southerners and white Southerners have always lived very closely in very intimate ways. He calls it a form of bad faith. He says that people who are racist in this way, they know what they're doing is wrong. Ignorance is not the reason why they do what they do. It's a form of bad faith, because if you can have a group of people who you can treat the way you want to inhumanely, that kind of saves you from the responsibility of having a humane society. Because if you can kind of have a nice facade, and then on the underbelly of everything have these people who you can expose all your fury and anger towards, that can kind of solve you from the human problem of creating a democratic egalitarian society. And Lewis Gordon kind of argued this idea. And I want to put this in the context of George Stinney, because in the current present day, there's actually controversy in South Carolina about whether George Stinney actually did kill those 2 young girls. And this actually is the niece of one of those young girls. Now, she was born 2 years after her aunt was killed. So she never even met her aunt, never knew her aunt. But in this photo, you can see her almost reenacting the way that her aunt was killed, as if she was there and she saw it and she knew what happened. You can see her. And this is a quote from her. She said that it's always been one-sided. They're trying to make this about race, and it wasn't about race. It's not that we believe hearsay that we grew up with all these years. We've done our research. We've talked to people that were actually there. The people who read these articles in the newspaper don't know the whole truth. So many people in the family of those 2 young girls still believe that George Stinney was responsible for the deaths of those 2 young girls. And the way I frame it in terms of bad faith is that even if you believe that that's what happened, his Sixth Amendment rights were violated. He wasn't given a fair trial. He wasn't given representation that was fair. So even if he did kill those 2 girls, if you believe in your criminal justice system the way it's set up, you still would be opposed to what happened to George Stinney. So it's a form of bad faith to even position yourself as if, no, he did it, he deserved what he got, when if you hold up your society as being, equal before the law and having those equal protections, and we know at the very minimum all those things happened, and they were all violated with George Stinney. And this is actually another one. He was 13 years old when the George Stinney case happened, and his father was one of the cops who arrested George Stinney. And he says that I was sad more for the little girls than I was for the kid that was guilty. He admitted to the crime. No one questioned the fact that he didn't do it. He did it. Dad said that he admitted to doing it, and in fact showed them the railway. It was like a railway kind of iron that he said he used to kill the 2 young girls. And he said, I think he got exactly what he deserved. He just didn't get it soon enough. And this is his opinion in 2015, not his opinion 20 years ago, his opinion right now. So essentially, what I ask is that, if you have a society that's so invested in anti-blackness, what if democracy is actually the problem? If you have a society where people kind of have bad faith rationales for even being racist, how can you ever have a democracy that's actually truly egalitarian, where people can live, equitably with full protections under the law, if your society is based on these ideas of anti-blackness? And I think one example, I want to wrap up now, but one example that I think is important is the example that was here in Natchez during Reconstruction. And I think that I'm reading a book now called Reconstructing Democracy. It's about grassroots politicians, black grassroots politicians in the Natchez region in Louisiana and also in Mississippi in the Reconstruction years. And about how these politicians, they were slaves 4 or 5 years prior. And after slavery, they became county commissioners, tax commissioners, sheriffs, all these important officials. And the idea is that by excavating what their political campaigns and kind of backgrounds were, you can see how they had a radical egalitarian vision for the South. They actually had direct democracy in Natchez during that time period, where local people would come together in a public forum and talk to their commissioners or whatever and say, look, I don't believe that you're doing this right. Let's debate it in public. And that's how democracy kind of flourished in this area of the United States during Reconstruction. Now, unfortunately, after Reconstruction, white paramilitary groups kind of terrorized those politicians and killed many of those people, so it never flourished. But this was one moment in American society where you actually had that moment of radical egalitarianism being almost realized by those people who live here in the Natchez area during Reconstruction. So just to end, this is a picture I took of Mr. Hinton at the end, and just, in his idea, he said that reform is impossible for the criminal justice system. He said that imagine being on death row for 30 years for a crime you did not commit, and then getting released with the state saying we were wrong and no restitution. So he has no faith in reform. He says that the only thing that can essentially end the kind of bloodthirst of the state is to end the death penalty, period, categorically. He said that because only then you can kind of stem that genocidal instinct of our society that says that certain people are beyond the scope of humanity and deserve to die. And that's what Mr. Hinton kind of left us all with. And that's kind of what I want to leave our presentation with. So thank you all for listening.
By now, we've all heard of the McKinney, Texas pool incident. The viral video from North Texas, known as the McKinney pool incident, shows a McKinney police officer grabbing a 15-year-old black female teenager dressed in only a bikini by her hair, shoving her to the ground, and forcefully pressing his knee into her back. When other black teenagers approached, the officer cursed at them and brandished his gun. The story has garnered national news coverage and produced a series of headlines. Newspapers and news outlets from the McKinney, Texas area produced headlines suggesting that the pool incident was not indicative of the city's racial politics. For example, the Dallas News ran a story entitled, "Let's Not Judge City Over Pool Party Incident." Amidst the McKinney Police Department's investigation of the quote-unquote incident, national news outlets like ABC News were among many to announce that Eric Casebolt, the McKinney officer in the video, had resigned. Sources like the Salon pointed to how the video illuminated the United States' perpetual violent treatment of black girls, with headlines like, "America's War on Black Girls, Why McKinney Police Violence Isn't About One Bad Apple." Even conservative news outlets found a way to incorporate the McKinney pool incident into their news cycle, with Fox News anchors inserting the McKinney pool incident into their usual formula of news reporting. Insert social/cultural event phenomenon, apply racially troubling analytic or stereotype, which equals President Obama is to blame for anything to come, with the headline, "Obama to blame for the McKinney pool incident." My point being, regardless of your news orientation, we have all heard of the McKinney, Texas pool incident. But by a show of hands, how many people have heard the name Dejaria Becton? Anyone? You may not know her name, but you have already seen her body subjected to police brutality. Dejaria Becton is the 15-year-old girl from the now infamous McKinney pool incident. Though the violence against her body has been on display for weeks, Dejaria's name has been omitted from the majority of the headlines and news stories. Instead, the moniker of the McKinney pool incident has obscured her humanity. Officer Casebolt's tenure at the McKinney Police Department, or the lack thereof, has overshadowed Dejaria's trauma, all the while Dejaria's body oscillates from one website to another via social media, essentially nameless. And while some may argue that Dejaria's name has been omitted from the news due to the fact that she is a minor, we are all aware from the historical examples of George Stinney, Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robertson, Carol Denise McNair, to the more contemporary examples of Tamir Rice and Ayanna Jones, that black children are rarely, if ever, afforded the privileges of innocence and protection from state violence and police brutality that childhood in this country affords. On the contrary, the exclusion of Dejaria's name is one more example of a long history of the neglect of black women in the discussion of police brutality. Take, for example, this famous photo. This photo was taken at the Monson Motor Lodge in St. Augustine, Florida on June 18, 1964, the day before the Civil Rights Act was passed. Hotel owner Jimmy Brock is photographed pouring acid into the large pool to force the black swimmers out of the whites-only pool. Since then, we have learned the name of the lodge owner and two of the swimmers that day, J.T. Johnson and Al Lingo. But today, which marks 51 years to the day that the photo was taken, do we know the name of the black woman in this photo? Like Dejaria, her body is the site of state and white vigilante violence. The agony of her face renders the insidiousness of racism visible for us. But unfortunately, much like the news stories about Dejaria Becton, history has neglected to say her name even 51 years later. I point out these instances to establish that violence against black women's bodies has been spectacularly visible, while black women themselves have been obscured from their very own narratives of violence. But physical violence is only one type of violence afflicting black women. Today I want to talk about a different type of violence against black women, a violence that does not attack their corporal bodies, yet nevertheless leaves them undocumented, unaccounted for, and virtually nameless. That violence is the omission of black female orators and speeches from the canon of civil rights history. Civil rights history in general has privileged the orations and rhetorical sophistication of the movement's black male leaders. Their speeches have been memorialized and their papers have been archived in many instances. These men have been lauded for their eloquence and unabashed truth-telling, and deservedly so. But Black female orators in their speeches have not consistently received the same praise. In many instances, they have been overlooked and understudied. And I consider that neglect a specific type of violence that works in tandem with the physical violence against Black women that is worthy of our immediate attention. Granted, my aim is not to assess which brand of violence is more pressing or more damaging, as no one can dispute the material effects of violence on Black women and girls. I am, however, suggesting that we analyze the omission of Black women's names from the stories of police brutality and white vigilante violence, and the omission of Black women's names from the rhetorical history of the Civil Rights Movement simultaneously. In so doing, we may begin to see how the discursive or written exclusion of Black women's contributions to intellectual and rhetorical histories of the civil rights informs, perpetuates, and in some cases strengthens their exclusion in their own narratives of violence and disenfranchises Black women in both their lived experience and in the imagination of the United States. Thus, this presentation will do two things. It will suggest two reasons for the omission of Black female rhetorical contributions to the Civil Rights Movement history, and then I will analyze the rhetorical strategies of a speech that Fannie Lou Hamer gave in Harlem, New York, at the Williams Institutional CME Church in 1964. So contrary to popular belief, there is an extensive, rich Black female rhetorical history. Since the 19th century, Black women have used their speeches to publicly confront both the gendered and racial discrimination that they are subjected to. From female orators like Sojourner Truth to Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell, Black women have used their speeches as a space from which they could address and redress the hypocrisy of American society. So how then do we make sense of their absence from the civil rights speech canon? I propose two reasons. First, much of their obscurity is an extension of some of the gender politics of the civil rights movement itself. It has long been acknowledged that many women in the civil rights movement were denied leadership roles and speaking opportunities. Take, for example, the March on Washington. Dorothy Height, who was then the president of the National Council of Negro Women at the time, recounted that when she and her colleagues sought to secure speaking opportunities for women, they were told that such sex-specific work was not conducive to the movement as a whole. Granted, there are many exceptions to this rule, including Diane Nash and Fannie Lou Hamer, who gave several public speeches, but so many more women were not given such opportunities. This is further evidence in Black female literary production. Novels like Toni Cade Bombar's The Salt Eater and Alice Walker's Meridian highlight the way that Black men refused to share leadership roles with Black women, and as a result, forced Black women to do secretarial work or push them to the background of the movement, despite being just as, if not more qualified than their male counterparts. As a result, literary scholar Melissa Walker points out that each of these novels features a female protagonist suffering from a debilitating illness that is at least in part caused by the gender stress of the civil rights movement. And while both of these texts are novels and thus fictional, the latter, Walker's Meridian, is based on her own participation in the civil rights movement and voter registration in Mississippi. The second reason for the neglect of Black female rhetorical contributions is the overall lack of archiving of their speeches. In the introduction to their collection of speeches by female activists during the civil rights entitled Women in the Civil Rights Movement 1954 to 1965, Davis Huck and David E. Dixon explain that, quote, sadly, the great majority of women's speeches vanished upon utterance. All too many moments of transformative eloquence are simply irretrievable. In almost all instances, movement meetings were not recorded. And perhaps more importantly, most speakers spoke without notes or minimal outlines, end quote. Thus, the speeches and the Black female orators seem to be disappearing behind both the politics of the movement and the politics of archiving. But one figure who has not disappeared behind those obstacles is Fannie Lou Hamer. As a key member of Mississippi's Freedom Democratic Party, Hamer had the opportunity to give a brief speech at the Credentials Committee meeting at the 1964 Democratic National Committee meeting. Moreover, her papers are housed at the Amistad Research Center at Tulane University, and several of her recorded speeches from 1963 and 1964 are housed at the Moses Moon Archive at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. Yet I chose to look at Hamer's speech not simply because we are in our home state. I chose to look at Hamer's speech in Harlem as an example of the rhetorical richness of Black female orators like Hamer. Hamer begins the speech recounting her experience in the Winona jail in 1963. Returning from a voter educational registration event in Charleston, South Carolina, Hamer was arrested in Winona, Mississippi. She recalls being in the cell when 2 Black male prisoners and a patrolman entered her cell and began beating her with a blackjack. She describes that experience as such. Quote, "The state highway patrolman gave the first Negro prisoner a blackjack, which is a long, heavy leather something made with something you could hold it, and it was loaded with either rocks or something metal. They ordered me to the bed on my face, and I was beat by the first Negro until he was exhausted," end quote. She goes on to explain that as she lied there being beat, her dress came up. And in an attempt to pull it down, she was impeded by a white officer who then pulled her dress all the way up as high as it can go. And when she began to scream, another white man got up, beating her in the head, leaving her with a blood clot in one of the arteries of her left eye. If Hamer wanted to end her speech here to illustrate the racialized and sexualized violence that Black women were susceptible to in Mississippi, she could have done that easily. But Hamer goes further and asserts that, quote, "We have made an appeal for the President of the United States and the Attorney General to please protect us in Mississippi. And I can't understand how it's out of their power to protect people in Mississippi. They can't do that, but when a white man is killed in the Congo, they can send people there," end quote. Hamer's rhetorical moves here are both powerful and purposeful. In 1963, 1 year before Hamer's speech in Harlem, the white men who beat Hamer were acquitted in a federal court by an all-white jury. But in retelling her own story of police brutality and abuse in the context of her self-authored speech, I argue that Hamer is both a victim and an active witness to the racialized and sexualized violence against Black women. In this speech, Hamer can testify to her experience of violence to a quote-unquote jury of her peers in Harlem, but not for the sake of assessing the legality of what happened to her, but to assert her humanity, which the federal court refused to see in their ruling on the trial. Hamer pulling down her dress symbolizes her attempt to maintain her dignity and autonomy over her body despite the very real threat of sexual violence, as were her screams and leg kickings. And Hamer shares this with the audience not to show them that racism is bad or evil. This is the fact that they would most likely know is true from firsthand experience. Instead, she uses the violence against her body to illuminate the hypocrisy of the United States and the contradictory meanings of citizenship. Hamer astutely and intuitively points out that white men can access the inherent protection attached to U.S. citizenship domestically and internationally, regardless to whether or not they perpetuate violence against Black women and Black people. Moreover, Hamer's critique suggests that violence of white men against Black women in Mississippi is not only tolerated, but it's also projected onto Black people internationally, i.e. the people in the Congo, then used to justify the United States' violent invasion of predominantly Black countries. In other words, by turning her embodied experience in Winona, Mississippi jail into a textual example, Hamer reveals the disparities of American citizenship and a matrix of domestic and international U.S. violence. Hamer also challenges the racial and socioeconomic stereotypes about Mississippians in her speech in Harlem. People have said year after year, Hamer points out, those people in Mississippi can't think. But after we would work 10 and 11 hours a day for $3 lousy and couldn't sleep, we couldn't do anything but think. And we've been telling them, and we've been thinking a long time, we're tired of what's going on, end quote. Hamer's statement directly challenges the criteria for who can intellectually challenge the status quo. Whereas traditionally a lower socioeconomic status and excessive labor conditions would be considered stifling to intellectual growth, Hamer's portion of this speech gestures towards those circumstances not only forcing one to think and rethink about his or her life, but catalyzing them into civic action. The poor pay and excessive labor have not numbed the minds of Mississippians. On the contrary, Mississippians have used those circumstances to think critically and ask, quote, as Hamer does in her speech, is democracy even real? Both of these examples from Hamer's speech illustrate the way that Black female speeches are a space from which Black female orators can repurpose and bear witness to the violence against them, which is so often ignored in legal contexts and challenge the notions that because of their geographic location, socioeconomic status, or living conditions, that they cannot effectively reflect on and critique the white supremacy undergirding American society. I began my paper with Dejaria Becton, who had been rendered invisible by news headlines across the country, yet the violence to her body is available for consumption across social media. In an effort to rectify that invisibility, Black feminists and womanists on Twitter began the hashtag #SayHerName. The hashtag was an effort to put names with faces for women and girls like Dejaria Becton, who are often overlooked because of the emphasis on the effects of police brutality on Black men and boys. The hashtag works to make these women legible and visible and human to the wider public that so often abandons them. As I close this presentation, I would like to suggest that the hashtag #SayHerName also be a space where we acknowledge female victims of police brutality and state violence and the Black female orators who use their words and eloquence to combat police brutality and state violence as well. Hashtag #SayHerName reminds us to not only memorialize these women's bodies, names, and words, but to understand that when we neglect their names and words, we make them susceptible to written and corporal violence. Moreover, hashtag #SayHerName is a useful mantra that we as oral historians can use so that we are intentional about excavating both Black female victims and freedom fighters' narratives in our oral histories as an attempt to redress the physical and written violence against both groups respectively. Thank you.
Outstanding presentations to think about, and I want to thank the students in particular who worked hard all throughout this week. Even though we were in the field, they were constantly refining and trying out ideas, testing out thoughts, working under not the most ideal conditions, but as you can see, really wonderful presentation. So as you can also see, they're thinking a lot about history, but not just about the movement and the Black freedom struggle back in the day, but what's happening now. And maybe most importantly, to paraphrase Dr. King, where do we go from here? So we have a lot of time for questions and ideas and thoughts. So now we want to turn it over to you all. If you have questions for the panelists, thoughts about their presentations. And I'll just kind of scan the audience if you want to raise your hand and just identify who you are and ask your question or comment. Yes, sir.
I guess I'll be the ball rolling because I got to go. I got people going from soccer practice. First of all, awesome presentation. I think don't have a question, just a comment. My name is Barnes Ojo. I'm a resident of Natchez. Member of this community the entire time of my life. The comment that I have is to the young lady, your name?
Randy.
Randy?
Randy.
Randy?
Yes.
I'm sorry, Randy. Fannie Lou Hamer, one of the most boisterous persons in the Civil Rights Movement, labeled the movement and gave it its phrase. I'm sick and tired.
Of being tired.
Sick and tired.
Right.
Look, I gotta go.
Thoughts or questions? Yes, sir.
My name is Peter Dodgerson from Natchez. Gentlemen, you know your name?
Justin.
Justin. You mentioned the difference in attempting to, find, express the origin of racism. You spoke of the difference between ignorance and bad faith. This is I don't have the answer. I'm asking. This is a problem for me living where I do. If I, don't Greek adage, knowledge is virtue, or they don't know what they're doing, give them a, if I don't believe it's ignorance, that means I have to believe that they're evil. And how do I go forward if I don't see the path forward in some form of enlightenment? if I see it only as some form of conversion, maybe you have to work on both tracks, but this is a problem I deal with, and I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Okay. I think that's something I might need some help from the panel. I think that's a very important question because it kind of gets to the nature of what it means to be a human being then. Because I think that part of the narrative or part of the story of us as human beings is that as human beings, we're all invested with a certain level of virtue that is uncompromisable and that we fall astray because of different constraints upon us. And I think that, oftentimes I think that we often fall on the narrative of, people, we're all good people on the inside, where we kind of create a duality between who we are on the inside and then who we are amongst the population as we live as human beings that exist in the world. I think that for some people, it becomes kind of an enclosure because, it becomes kind of how you have racism without racists. Because people, you can even see with George Finney's family, his family would say that case had nothing at all to do with race. Where we can say, most reasonable people now would say, well, yes, it did, if nothing else other than the fact that he was convicted in 2 hours by an all-white jury with no evidence. We would say race had a factor in it. So I think that ultimately it comes down to how we all see what it means to be human. And if, as human beings, regardless of race, are we virtuous? And if we're not naturally virtuous, how do we cultivate that virtue within us? I think that's the question. That's an important question because I think, of course, nobody is irredeemable. We've seen, if we would believe that, then Anthony Hinton would have been executed a long time ago if we see people as irredeemable. We're all redeemable. The fact is, how do we kind of work purposefully and actively to create ourselves and refashion ourselves to be those kinds of individuals and not assume that we are that by default, if you can understand what I'm saying. I think last time we think that by default, we're all good people who go astray, whereas no, you have to work to become a good person. You have to work to create an egalitarian vision and for what it means to be a human being. So it's just a matter of doing that actual work, and then what does it mean to do that kind of work? How do people start to begin to do that kind of work?
And I guess just to take a stab at it as well, we had a discussion last night when we were all going through our presentations. And Justin brought up the fact that a lot of times when you see these acts, people have to suspend their moral consciousness to do some of these acts. It doesn't mean that they live their entire lives immorally or that some type of something is going on, but there's a suspension of morality, at least for a moment. So I think what we need to do is we need to analyze what allows and what causes somebody to suspend their morality in that particular situation. So if you look at, for example, Mike Brown, you see an unarmed child or kid running away from a situation where he's supposed to be, or he's intended to be arrested. What causes you to suspend your morality in using any other tactic you know to disarm somebody who's running away and to reach for your gun and pull the trigger? These are things I think we need to analyze more closely as to what would cause somebody to do that. And I think once we can find those, we can begin to address them. And in his case, if you think he was Hulk Hogan or whatever types of terminology you want to use, then we have to begin to unpack, okay, well, why is this man Hulk Hogan versus, another child and so forth and so on. And then that leads to different assumptions we have about race and gender and so forth.
Sure, I think you had
I'm Jim Williams. I'm here in Natchez too. Now to turn up to kind of a piggyback question that Peter just asked. You gave your answers in terms of, just kind of a failure of personal morality in some ways. Well, we have a traditional idea of American history, and all American history, of course, has been the advance toward liberty and equality and justice. Oh, yes, and then there is that unfortunate racism thing. In other words, we have this beautiful face, and gee, isn't it too bad we have a war like this? There are a lot of historians, they're not radical historians at all, they've been saying this for a while, with a very different view of American history, that no denial of liberty to blacks was essential to the white man's notion of liberty. Oppression of blacks and slavery specifically was absolutely essential to the development of American capitalism and American industrial capitalism. Not just the plantation economy, the entire industrial capitalist economy. I would like to hear all of you if you had time to do this, but that's quite a different
view of American history, isn't it? It's not a wart on the end of our beautiful nose, it's a diseased internal organ. It's a lot more difficult to deal with. And so it'll take us some time.
Can I start?
Yes.
I think, I guess we could all say we see that as pretty correct. If that's radical, then we are very radical in our beliefs. But I do literary studies, and I particularly think about U.S. imperialism. And along the lines of what you're saying, for me, empire and the notion of going and colonizing other groups of people, particularly people of color, is another narrative that has always been a part of the United States. So whether you're talking about settler colonialism and expanding out west, and dispossessing people of color out west, dispossessing people in the Philippines in the Spanish-American War, or the invasion of Haiti in 1950. These things have been going on since the beginning. And so to your point, I think that it's very important to talk about racism in the United States, not just as fundamental to democracy, but fundamental to the United States maintaining its power as an imperial power. And that has to be sustained through, constant dispossession, constant colonizing, and the constant belief that people of color throughout the world are inferior. And so for me, if we think about that notion and think about things like slavery and the genocide of the Native Americans in the context of empire, to me, that only further illuminates how central racism is to United States history.
And I would say to that, I definitely would agree that in terms of, because I do my own research in New Orleans, Louisiana, and I see New Orleans as a site of capitalist exception, because you have a city where you have the precariousness of, the vulnerability to natural disasters, yet you also have offshore drilling that exacerbates that precariousness because of dredging and because of subsidence that occurs through the offshore drilling. And then you also have different factors in terms of Cancer Alley in southern Louisiana and different kinds of places where you have entire towns that, are kind of supported by chemical plants that actually have material effects on the health of people generation by generation by generation that people see, know, and can identify, yet these things still occur. So I think you're exactly right to the point that, in my own research, I look at the whole Gulf Coast area, particularly New Orleans and southern Mississippi and Texas, also Texas too, as capitalist exception, where the excesses of capitalism become manifest in such a hard-hitting, heavy way. And of course, we know that in terms of capitalism, in terms of American capitalism, the first multinational corporations of America were slave ships. We know that. So I think that by making that point explicit, that is one way to move forward, because part of the narrative of America is one of, like you said, liberty, egalitarianism, but also of unfettered capitalism. And capitalism not critique a good thing. This was what made America possible. And so many people, even people who may be of liberal leftist, a liberal orientation in lots of different ways, social, politically, they never question capitalism. Capitalism is always the assumed default, because how can you have things? I was arguing with somebody a few days ago who just said that, capitalism has given the world so much. We've had so many advances in health and income and, just in terms of people being able to kind of build things because of capitalism. And but yeah, at the cost of what? Who has access to those things that are being built? So I think that that's an important part, always having a critique of capital and the way that capital kind of dominates American society as the key point to understanding racism, classism, and the structure of our society. So I think you're 100% correct.
And I guess just to piggyback off of that, just going through history and also traveling a lot, I've noticed that in America specifically, and I'm not sure about too many other countries, but the countries that I've been to, America specifically, we have it's almost like a skill and art about forgetting where things come from and how things began. And we like to look at the here and now. And there's always this push for here, now, and forward. Here, now, and forward. We don't like to think about anything that happened in the past. Whereas if you go to other countries, it's, let's look at the past because we had X, Y, and Z in the past. We had Greek and Roman temples in the past. We had so forth and so on. And the question then becomes, okay, well, why do we like to forget the past so much, but so many other people like to cling to it? And once you begin to unpack that and start to understand, okay, well, it doesn't look as pretty as it used to, that causes us then to, I guess the best way to say it would be almost to reflect upon how we can deal with it. I don't know if that's the right terminology to use, but once we are able to look at the past, we can deal with the situations that we're going to, and then even though it looks ugly, we can begin to address it. Because if we continue to ignore it, then it's going to continue to be a problem of some people like to look at it, some people don't. And this stuff sounds very gratuitous and very harsh because it's coming from a context of, I didn't know any of that happened. Whereas if it's, well, we've heard things like that before, then we can begin to move forward and say, okay, well, how can we address restitution issues? How can we hashtag say her name? How can we so forth and so on? And I think addressing those pasts and realizing that they were ugly and they were dirty is the first step to moving into this whole idea of we don't have to forget anymore and we shouldn't forget.
Hi, AJ, University of Florida. I have a question. You guys can take it the way you want, but I want to throw it all out there. You mentioned that things are redeemable, and I was listening to you say that, and the first thing that came to mind was like, well, reparations, for example. So when we think about reparations, I then thought about what Mitt Romney said when he talked about a certain amount of people just want free things or stuff. So when I thought about that, I thought about welfare claims and how people and how women who get assistance from the state, use welfare claims. So this conversation from capitalism, borderline socialism, I wanted you to tackle that conversation as here we are promoting prosperity in a sense, but then there's people who need help, but then when they get help, they're villainized for receiving that help. So, and I also wanted to ask, did Mr. King get any rest? Did he get any money from the state?
Yeah.
He didn't get anything. Okay, so yeah, and what are we looking for redemption? What is an answer?
I start?
So yeah, welfare claims, state, women have it viewed, and how
No, I actually think that's a really important question. And I think, Black women occupy a very ambivalent and contradictory space in the Black imaginary. So on the one hand, as you pointed out, Black working class and poor Black women are, classified as welfare queens who are illegitimately getting benefits from the state, who lay up and have babies, all these things, even though we know historically that's been the stereotype about Black women before. They're extremely maternal, they're extremely domestic. And I think what that just kind of shows is the flexibility of these stereotypes, and really kind of this very dynamic nature of white supremacy, where it's able to change and remake stereotypes to fit specific historical context to continue to disenfranchise Black women. I think with regard to Black women and reparations specifically, yes, I'm here for financial reparations. But I think that we also have to get beyond seeking reparations in just legal and financial circumstances. We need to be talking about other types of freedoms that Black women have been denied. So whether that is sexual freedom, whether that is freedom to health care and to protect themselves sexually, to raise their children, freedom from surveillance at state in their homes, things that come with welfare, right, but are not discussed when we're talking about the requirements to actually be on welfare. It's heavily surveilled of who they can have in their house and what they can do. So I definitely think we have to talk about reparations, and I think we also have to be dynamic in our conversations about those as well, and consider, the multitude, as we talked about, of violences against Black women specifically.
I would say, too, to build off of that real quick, that I think in order to have that discussion on what reparations should look like, I would say the first step is you need to tell me what you did. If we're into any type of argument or dispute or there's something going on, you need to tell me, let's say it's a relationship, you're in an argument or relationship. Tell me what you did wrong, and then we can begin to talk about how you can fix it. The problem is we've never talked about what happened, what went wrong. We talk about bits and pieces, And so then the arguments of reparations becomes, all right, well, let's give money because of slavery. But we don't talk about the social trauma that happened. Okay, well, how do we deal with that? So I think once we lay everything out on the table, then we can have a serious discussion about what reparations look like.
I think just quick thing, in American democracy, like we mentioned before, I think that the assumption of virtue in our institutions and the ability and the capability of our institutions to rectify situations. So I think we kind of have a narrative of virtue and innocence to where it's the people who are racist, who mess up the institutions. But the institutions in and of themselves are fine. Capitalism in and of itself is fine. It's just the racists who are capitalists who do it. You know, the legal system is fine. It's just the racists who are judges and prosecutors who do it. Where it's like, no, tackle the institutions. I think that's the important part about how you have to actively work to create the kind of society in which you want. And that's why I think in Natchez, looking at that radical period during Reconstruction, because you have people who are radically visioning what does it mean to have an egalitarian society and not just assuming that because we have a Bill of Rights, we already have that. What does it mean to actively construct and pursue a society in which you do have equal protections under the law? What does it mean to have justice? What does justice mean? How do you actively pursue justice in this context of capitalism and all these other things? So I think that it's about doing the work of not just assuming that the institutions are already there and people befuddle them, but looking at, no, the institutions themselves. Like Fannie Lou Hamer said, is democracy even real? She had to catch, she was to the point where she was questioning, is democracy even, is it even possible? So I think that that's what these case studies that we've all done kind of show, the importance of you have to actively construct the world that you want to be and not just assume that it'll happen if we all just scale back and think differently all of a sudden.
All right, we have to be respectful of our hosts, so we have time for 2 more questions.
My name is Jeremy Houston. I started working about George Stanton in 2011 after working with Troy, the whole Troy Davis situation. In 2011, I made contact with George Bryce, Alcaloo, South Carolina. In 2012, me and my wife at the time went to Alcaloo, and we went there to Mary Jane Bennett. We got buzzed.
Right.
We went to the site where she was at, and we also went to the old property where Stanton family lived at. We was also able to, in 2012, talk to Charles Stanton, who lived in Brooklyn, New York. That's George Donovan.
Okay.
And then this year, last year in 2014, they began to argue a case about exoneration. The 3 things that was in exoneration were Mr. Stanton's family get a public apology from the state of South Carolina from Mckinney. They get a burial site, a headstone for him, and also like a restitution or reparation. And this year in 2015, I think in April, finally, he got exonerated by the state of South Carolina. So I was wondering, were you following up on that?
Yeah, actually, I have been. It hasn't been in particular a research objective of mine because I do my work in New Orleans, but just to be conscious about what's going on. I have been kind of keeping tabs and following up, and I didn't know the detail that you just shared with me in terms of the kind of outlines of what the family wanted in terms of restitution, a headstone, and those kind of material things. I didn't know those things. I think that those are important.
Because afterwards, they said that one of the older people, his grandson, said, yeah, we know where it is. My grandfather would take us to where he was buried. And they showed us a place that was like grass and everything like that. And they said that was he was supposed to be buried.
Okay. We can.
Last question.
Small McCullough. I just want to say all the presentations were wonderful. Took some notes and I've been studying my notes. I want to speak to each of the presentations. I had a lot going on, but all these presentations were wonderful, so forgive me, I'll try to speak to each of the presentations. I'll speak to the brother who made the first presentation. Your presentation resonated with me because I could invest, I could attach to your presentation because my mom was one of those young people they picked up during Parchment. You spoke about PTSD, and it kind of had me look at or retrace where I am with my views and my perspective. knowing as a child that she went through what she went through, being picked up and taken to Parchment. Growing up, I always just used to tell Mom, you just snap on me, Mom, just chill out, but it wasn't until really I got older and I started to understand where was all this bitterness coming from. Excuse my French, towards white people, it's like the drop of a hat. Like you cross it, she just snapped. So once I really started to understand that, I realized the trauma she had went through. And you spoke about it being passed down through Mom. Well, that also brought to my incidents I experienced. I moved back here in the 6th grade. 7th grade, I was playing basketball at the junior high school. For the locals, you may know where Barton Junior High School used to be. But each day I got out of basketball practice, I would walk home to my mother's house, or my grandmother's house. And for people who lived here, I had to walk past Dunnavant, from Martin past Dunnavant, past Picket Path, past the hitching post, past the paper mill, to get all the way out to Linwood. I don't know how many miles that is, but one particular day after practice, right in front of Dunnavant, a truck pulled up with a Confederate flag, and there was about 4 or 5 teenage white guys pulled over to the curb, and they just started pelting me with beer bottles. They said, run, nigga, run. Now, this was in 1982. I graduated in 1987. This was 1982, right in front of Donovan. Just to speak to what you were speaking about, the PTSD, it finally dawned on me as you were presenting that my wife loved to go to, I think it's called the castle, which is behind the carriage house. Well, she would always say, baby, let's go to the castle for breakfast this morning. And I started knowing, well, I don't want to go to the castle, let's go to the carriage house. And as you were presenting, I thought about, well, the gateway into Dudley, where the castle is, that is where I was pelted by the bottles in the convoy of a truckload of white boys saying, run, nigga, run. But it never dawned on me. I just thought I preferred the carriage house to the castle. So that was your presentation. Second, gentleman, your presentation resonated with me when you talked about the closeness of races and how racism can't be ignorance. And that reminded me of something that my grandfather taught me coming up. He said, well, son, the only difference between racism in the South and the North is that in the South, they don't care how close you get, just don't get too high. Up North, they don't care how high you get, just don't get too close. So, your presentation resonated with me. And finally, the young lady on the end, your presentation resonated with me first and foremost because I have 4 daughters of my own. So your presentation called me to rethink some of the things that I teach, that I share, talk to my daughters about. I have 4 daughters from the ages of 10 to 24. And another part of your presentation resonated with me when you spoke about Betty Payne and her dress during her ordeal in jail. And I recall a story my mom told me when she was in jail. She suffered large burns over her legs when she was a child. So she had to have a skin graft. And I never forget the story she told me when they took her to Parchment. They had all the ladies undressed and holding down and fed X-Lax and everything. And she said when she took her dress off, she had on some pantyhose. When she took her dress off, the officer, the correctional officer had her to take her pantyhose off too. And she said when she pulled those down, he said, oh my God, they can pull yours back up. Because her legs were, to this day, just deformed from the skin graft. So I was able to personally attach to each of your presentations. I want to thank you. They were all wonderful presentations.
Thank you.
We appreciate it. I thank you. You did a wonderful job.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We want to give Mr. White and the museum the last word, but I just want to close on our part at the University of Florida by saying again how grateful we are for the opportunity to share with you this evening, to learn from you. We are in town for a full day of interviewing and hearing more stories tomorrow, and Mr. White may talk about that. But again, thank you so much for being here. It means a lot to us, and we look forward to continuing this discussion.
Recently, I received a text message that for some reason or another, I feel it is very apropos to this gathering this evening. The first thing I want to say is we cannot solve our nation and our world's problems just by what has transpired here this evening. It's larger than anything inside of this room. However, we must remember that one determined person can make a significant difference. And that a small group of determined people can change the course of history. So this is our small group. Okay? My charge to you is, if you do not engage in conversation about issues pertaining to race with someone of the opposite race, then you will be contributing to the continuation of the problem. You will continue to be a part of the problem rather than a part of the solution. So reach out, engage in those conversations, because the more folks we get to talk about it, the easier it will become for change to take place. I quote a little Socrates and I'm gonna shut up. I cannot teach anybody anything. What I just hope to do is make people think. So you've been given food for thought today. Let it roll around. Put your own spin to it. And then go forth and have these conversations with others. There was an old TV commercial some years ago, and the catchphrase was, to change the world, you have to start small. So, the small group of people are now being charged with the responsibility of taking a bit of what you have experienced this evening and spread it out. Johnny Appleseed, drop the seed, orchards will grow. I can't do it all myself. These folks here cannot be expected to handle it all. You're going to need some help. Help will come, can begin to come, from many of you assembled here this evening. So I want to thank you for your time and your presence. This conversation I know could have gone on longer, but I also want to be fair to folks who have taken up time to come here and not make it run so long that they start wiggling in the chair. Don't necessarily want to be disrespectful. I do like they do in the church, put their finger up and walk. Okay? Thank you for your presence. Again, we're going to do what we can. And that's all we can do.
Okay, everyone else wants to talk to you about